Hey there, welcome to the Reinsurance Podcast, the place where we dive into all things reinsurance, the coolest part of insurance. We're your hosts, Jared and Ben, a couple of ex-practitioners who loved the industry so much we founded Supercede to tackle some of its biggest headaches. And we're here to share our insights and stories with expert guests as we uncover what's really going on in the industry. So welcome back to one of our favorite episodes of the year, the 1/1 recap episode. I'm here with Thomas Byard. Welcome.
Thank you. Good to be here.
We do this one every year. It's when you talk about like our coverage of the reinsurance industry, like what happened at 1/1 is like 80% of the news in our industry at times.
It's 100% of the gossip in the second half of the year.
Yeah.
And then, all of the news for about a month.
Yeah. It presents a really fun lens to look at this industry from because you're right. It is like sort of months of buildup of just like rumor mills and gossip. But at the end of the year, like the lights come on, right? And we kind of go, so what did it all pan out like? How did the renewal season go? Let's tuck in. Big themes. There's a handful or so of really major themes that we saw. The one that was presented a lot in the buildup, which we sort of expected, was a reduction in rates for prop cat, mostly for non-loss affected stuff.
Yeah, I think we gave an update on this a couple of weeks ago in the news, but basically those rate reductions started to accelerate as we got closer to the renewal period. I think back when we were talking about Monte Carlo and Baden-Baden, people were talking about kind of single-digit rate decreases, and non-loss affected programs were down kind of 10 to 15% in the end. So, much more softening than I think the market was expecting or was braced for.
One of the sort of things we'd sort of heard from clients was there was more access to retro than maybe was expected, and that freeing up sort of increased the reinsurer appetite later. As you say, as the renewal season went on, there was more capacity to deploy, and it just became more competitive, and that drove further rate reductions.
That is, a couple of people have said that the retro was done on time for the first time for about 5 years.
Yep.
And that, really led to a bit of increased capacity right towards the end.
Yeah. So that's a big one. But if you had a loss impacted book, as expected, the competition was on the loss free programs. And so you definitely see some people getting hit with 30%-ish increases for those.
And that was regionally driven as well. So I think some of the Italian carriers, the Turkish carriers, didn't fare too well. They probably see a headline about overall risk reductions, overall market softening, and feel a bit sick. Given their experiences, because some of those programs were up 20 or 30%.
Yeah. So some difficult budgeting conversations for a few cedents who had tough underwriting years on that side. The next major one that we saw, or kind of maybe related to that, was capacity for the lower layers was still a bit hard to find.
Yeah, so for the last several years, reinsurers have been trying to attach much higher in programs. Competition's been building for kind of the top layers of programs. We've seen a lot of new capacity that's come into various lines of business, has really been geared at those top layers, and people have continued to really struggle to get those bottom layers filled. Sometimes they're taking on more risk, and in an inflationary environment that will always happen, right? Because you have more attritional losses start creeping into those bottom layers just purely because of inflation, and that's a reinsurer would always argue that's not what reinsurance is for. That's what insurance companies are meant to cover themselves.
Yeah. Well, and that was the other question I was going to add to this is, one, it was the first sort of point when the market began to harden that reinsurers really sort of clawed back, was this sort of protection on the bottom. But two, to the thing you just mentioned, how much do you think this perceived a role of reinsurance sort of covering secondary perils and these types of things is, again, it's the reinsurers sort of pushing back and saying, we don't want to be down here collecting claims for these we are supposed to be sort of sitting above this threshold to provide the protection for these extreme events, these extreme aggregation elements, rather than
you can certainly see their point, right? But when you get into an environment like we've seen recently with climate change and things like that, where actually secondary perils are driving greater loss expense than the primary perils that reinsurance is there to cover, actually the risk is that reinsurers start to become less relevant in the market. So there's always going to be a balancing act between responding to a changing environment and a changing planet and changing risk profiles, whilst at the same time maintaining that, you know, we're there to keep you in business when things are truly bad. The industry does quite well at kind of responding to new emerging risks, but changes in profile to older, more established risks, they're perhaps a little bit slower to respond.
Well, and we'll talk more about sort of the role data played in the renewal season for a couple classes, but it makes you also recognize when the attachment points are going up, it's incredibly important that the cedents have the ability to interrogate what their books look like to better understand the exposures that they're taking on. It's not just this, we'll just throw it all at the reinsurers and, you know, present our position as our threshold by which we have an appetite to absorb losses. But in order to understand what you're buying and at what attachment point you're comfortable with or you can withstand, like, it's incredibly important to be able to articulate your underlying data, carve that apart, and buy programs that help you ensure you're protecting the business at the levels that make sense for you.
And how much work is involved in that? It really varies depending on who you are and what your insurance company look like. Something that we saw specifically with our clients was a big difference between our clients who are large insurance companies and our clients who are smaller insurance companies. Those larger insurance companies were able to make trade-offs with other programs. So they were getting participation on low layers of a property deal, for example, in exchange for top layers on cyber or specialty or marine and energy there was loads of capacity for this year. So the big players actually found that really easy, and they could use kind of market forces and trading techniques to get those layers filled. The smaller companies had a much more difficult job with that, just because they have less exposure to go and trade off, which meant they had to dedicate much more time to the storytelling and to really deeply analysing how profitable their books were, how robust and resilient their books were this year compared to previous years. And they had to show kind of an improvement in resilience and risk profile.
Yeah. Well, that brings me nicely onto the sort of next major sort of component of the renewal was the differentiation that drove outcomes specifically in casualty, right? And we talk about the sort of months-long build-up in advance of the renewal season. The one around casualty was there's a lot of trapped capacity still. There's a lot of concern about how developments are going to come through.
It was 2 years, right?
Yeah.
Pretty much leading up to this renewal period. I think the year before last, we started hearing whispers around reserve adequacy, some concerns that people had, particularly in US casualty markets. And it was kind of quietly spoken about around the edges of conferences in 2023. And then in 2024, it became a major talking point and was a big part of the renewal season. But I think having that kind of 2-year lead up to the renewal that was going to be impacted meant that people could like really sit up and spend time working out how they were going to counter that and how they were going to tell a better story and how they were going to get more data and how they were going to get more robust data around showing underlying strength in those portfolios that reinsurers would be concerned about. Yeah.
Well, and that sort of drove the sort of maybe two camps of cedents in that class, right? Cedents that had really high quality data that they could articulate and use that to drive their stories, as well as cedents who are sufficiently larger. When as you say, they had the trade-off elements, or you had small cedents who read a lot of casualty without good data, who are kind of at the mercy of what the renewal season was going to sort of shake out at.
Yeah, and we bang this drum repeatedly that there's people who care about their data have better outcomes. Even if being more transparent about a portfolio shows an increase in risk in some areas, actually the level of comfort that gives a reinsurer will still drive a positive outcome for you when you compare it to just not providing data or providing data with holes in it. So I think that's kind of a well-established trend. What I was interested by and the thing that we found really interesting looking at how clients were responding were how kind of inventive and entrepreneurial people were getting around telling stories. They were pulling data points that we'd never seen pulled into our system before. We were being asked to create kind of brand new features that helped to tell better stories with data that we'd never seen before. Really hard work from the team in delivering some of the features. Given the time constraints that people had, we kind of had to build this stuff during a renewal period. But we were able to get it out, and we were able to support those customers in telling stories that I don't think the industry had really had to tell before.
Yeah. Well, and I think that data control piece is big there as well, because when the reinsurers get data points that they've not seen before and ask questions about it, being able to turn those answers around very quickly and be able to have sort of like a grasp. It's not just necessarily more data for the sake of it. It's like the ability to interrogate that data and control and sort of manipulate it in a way that it always is consistent. It's always giving you the sort of aggregate position, but with different lenses on it at all times. It reminds you of those little circular color things that you can sort of slot onto each other, and each time different things emerge. That's how we're thinking about data in our industry now, right? You're saying here's all of it, and then the reinsurers can slot on the different lens filters that they think matter, and they're getting the pictures that...
Like when you're at the opticians.
Yeah.
Is that better or worse?
Yeah, exactly.
But I think
but for data and reinsurance, always more is better. Better every time.
There's what has been really interesting has been how steep that learning curve has had to be for reinsurers. And we saw some real big disparities between different reinsurers as to how quickly they could get their arms around new data points that they were receiving and new narratives and new types of stories that they were being given by cedents.
Yeah.
Some responded really, really well to that. They're typically the ones that have adopted technology faster and kind of are known to be more innovative. And some of them were really slow to that. And I think they probably struggled to give pricing nuance where they were getting submission nuance.
Yep. Yeah, you did see a tone though where on the whole the feedback was really positive about the reinsurers, at least willingness to understand that. I
don't think any reinsurer is going to say, no, give us less data. If someone goes, do you want more data? They're going to kind of lick their lips and go, yes, please. I think the reality of how many of those reinsurers actually used that new data, though, is where I felt that there was some disparity.
Yeah, I think there's a select number of reinsurers, as you say, who were able to fully utilize it, and others who kind of looked at it and went, I'll give you benefits of the doubt points, right? Improvement, because I think this is generally better. I have no ability to actually run it through my models yet, but I understand what you're doing here, and I'm giving you sort of credit points, perhaps.
Yeah, so and you know, it's difficult. I know it's not like an area of the industry that we're particularly involved in, but if you're a pricing actuary pricing off of spreadsheets still, it can be very hard to adapt and change a model with a couple of months' notice.
Yeah. Well, and sometimes it was less than a couple months even, right? It was middle of the last couple of weeks of December, like, here's some more data points that we think are important for this narrative, and what can you do with it? Talking about sort of capacity and where reinsurers wanted to grow, another big theme that we saw was an increased appetite to grow in specialty lines by the reinsurers.
Yeah, so particularly kind of marine and aviation. We saw a big increase in capacity there. And then what was surprising for a lot of kind of market commentators was that there was actually an increase in a lot of political violence and war lines. Given that the world is more unstable, I don't think people were expecting, increased capacity in that area, but I think it did come through.
Yeah. And there was increase in ILS capacity. There's a the GC numbers, I can't pull it off the top of my head. It was like a 6 to 10% increase in overall market-wide capacity, like huge step changes in the amount of capacity available. And in the interest rate environment that we find ourselves in, it was maybe more than people were expecting, sort of at the top level, right? And then you sort of look across where they want to deploy that into property and casualty. And even at the end of that, there was capacity to continue to sort of, so there were, I think early on, the reinsurers had much bigger pools of capacity they were looking to deploy. The big chunks were obviously easy to deploy in the big lines, but specialty making tons of sense as the next best place to.
Well, I thought that was kind of an interesting play from the legacy reinsurers as they continued to defend an entrenched position against ILS funds and non-traditional capital. What they've actually done is demonstrated that there's more appetite for traditional reinsurance capacity in more profitable lines. Yeah. And I think the reason I think that's clever is because if you're an institutional investor, it starts to become maybe even more attractive to invest in a traditional reinsurer than it is to put the capital directly into a non-traditional fund.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because if you had, if sort of all things were equal and you had enough capacity across your book, do you think most cedents would still choose to then defer back to traditional? And ILS is sort of a plug for capacity needs?
I think it depends. I think so part of it's the line of business, right? And I know we're going to talk about cyber specifically in a while, but what we see there is kind of a market that's moved from the simple quota share into much more complex covers. And if you're buying an XL cover, then you would typically want that to be from a legacy traditional reinsurer. But we've seen more cyber cat bonds than ever before, and when you're looking for that kind of large kind of stop loss cover or cat cover, there's no reason not to use non-traditional capacity.
We did see there seemed to be quite an increase. The numbers and the anecdotes of it were high, and there was a number of sort of small stories that sort of trickled to the news about the size and the growth of cat bonds specifically across the market. So I think there was still a lot of appetite for them, and a lot of people, I think there's an increased creativity around cat bonds. That was sort of the anecdotal sense from sort of perusing the news and having conversations in the market
there's been so much innovation in the last 4 or 5 years, I would say, in terms of parametric covers that are available in the insurance world. And reinsurance has been stuck with the traditional cat bond or an ILW for years, and there's not really been a huge amount of innovation in that space. And I think we are starting to see a bit more innovation in those covers that have parametric triggers.
So lots to sort of watch for 2025 on that, I think. And then you mentioned cyber. There was a lot of chatter around the variety of structures and the types of data being deployed and how cedents and reinsurers are sort of evolving what that offering looks like. What's your sort of lens on that from the conversations you're having?
Well, it's obviously cyber's a subject that's quite close to my heart. So I was kind of following those news stories with a bit more interest than otherwise, and talking to clients and cedents that we know. It's interesting. So there was one narrative that it was kind of, there was more demand for non-proportional cyber treaties this year than they'd seen previously. Actually, that doesn't really marry up with conversations that I'd been having. I think that particularly for a lot of the clients and cedents that I've been talking to, people have wanted non-proportional cyber reinsurance for a long time, for 3 or 4 years. And it's been the supply side that's been kind of letting them down, that reinsurers haven't had that appetite to do it. I think, and sometimes that narrative is difficult to get right. I think in most lines of business, they're so completely dominated by Aon and Guy Carpenter as the the massive incumbent broking machines that they are, and in cyber that they don't have that level of domination. So Gallagher, even when they were legacy Capsicum and Gallagher Re, huge investments, great cyber team, lots of investment there, and so a decent amount of market share. And in recent years, Howden have really, after bringing in Luke Ford-Kelsey and that team from Aon, have really taken a lot of the market there. So listening to the same narratives from the two biggest brokers doesn't always mean you're getting the kind of accurate frontline information when it comes to cyber. I think sometimes you do need to look at the Gallaghers and the Howdens of the world, because they might just be a little bit closer to it.
Yeah, it's what are you thinking is driving that shift? This sort of shift in capacity, this shift in reinsurer appetite for the XL structures.
Well, it's understanding, right? The cedent demand for non-proportional covers as opposed to proportional covers is really driven by the insurance companies understanding more about the risks that they're taking on. It's about that market evolving to a point where it's relatively stable. It went through a number of peaks and troughs kind of between 4 and 10 years ago, I guess, where it was seen as very unstable and the data was seen as very unreliable, and past data had absolutely no bearing on future performance of different portfolios, for the most part, for kind of the US standalone market, which is probably 90% of the premium that comes into that market. I think small endorsement SME European covers have been a bit more profitable, a bit more stable over that time. But as companies have got much more comfortable with that risk, then obviously they start to want to take on covers that protect them against cat events, for example. So cyber cat bonds being bought by Beazley and a few others this year, and then a real move towards non-proportional covers as kind of the standard way of covering off that risk. So that's the demand side. The shift that we've seen this year has been on the supply side, and I think reinsurers are often a little bit slower to gain understanding about lines of business. We've seen a huge amount of investment in team strength and in people at reinsurers in cyber in particular. I think often, specialty underwriters used to kind of take on the cyber role, or someone who'd done a bit of financial lines or something like that would kind of take that cyber role on. I think we're seeing now more specialists move into those underwriting roles, perhaps from insurance into reinsurance. We're seeing increased appetite to write reinsurance amongst like Lloyd's carriers, for example, in cyber. And we're seeing a huge influx of talent on the broking side as well. So a huge number of previously insurance brokers or insurance underwriters moving into reinsurance broking roles, again with cyber there. So that increase in experience and is going to make people much more comfortable to write those non-proportional deals.
Yeah, it also, I think, is aligned with a bit of stabilization in the primary offering. I think in the first few years, it at least seemed from an outsider, I'm not as close to the cyber market as you are, but it seemed like there's obviously a demand to protect against this exposure, but we didn't quite know what we were protecting against and for. And you had all these sort of random of like get pitch events and these things sort of like they're important, but we're still sussing it out. So
you still do, right? So we're building I shouldn't do a plug, but we're building an integration at the moment with CyberCube. And when you look at kind of the data template that they use for predictive modeling or cat modeling within cyber, the number of coverages that they're looking for like sublimit information against, like there's 15 to 20 different kind of distinct coverage sections that they're expecting sublimit information about, and that actually takes that all the different various combinations that are possible there actually requires quite deep technical expertise in order to just put a product offering out into the market.
Yeah. So from a reinsurer's perspective, if the cedents book is evolving like dramatically over it's very hard to anchor into an Excel structure. But because you like the quota share model because it at least forces the cedent to keep skin in the game the whole way through.
Yep.
But as those underlying products stabilize a bit more as well, it gives additional reassurance to the reinsurer.
as a reinsurer walking in, or a specialty lines reinsurer or a financial lines reinsurer, to walk in, look at a portfolio, and understand whether a higher ransomware sublimit but a lower contingent business interruption sublimit will cancel each other out in terms of overall risk appetite is like completely unreasonable. There's no way you could do that.
Yeah. Well, and again, the role that data plays in all these conversations is central, but the reason we're talking to the CyberCube team and doing that work now is exactly the ability to say, chuck those data points into Supercede. You can immediately filter in and turn on and turn off what the book looks like with all these different components and activated, and that's a super, super important thing if you're going to the market with a narrative of here's what we're trying to.
Well, and the other thing is that companies don't just use one model. So it's similar to property cat modeling in the sense that there'll be, most reinsurers now will have some kind of proprietary data set. They'll have a CyberCube model, and they may have one or two others from other vendors as well. And so being able to push kind of the input data from that through APIs directly into their systems actually helps them to speed up their understanding of very complex, nuanced books of business.
Yeah. Well, in the reinsurance world, we are always going forward. 1-1's behind us. We're over you, 1-1. What are we thinking? What are we hearing as sort of like the expectations for 1-4 or 4-1 for our American friends? What is sort of the murmurings of what comes next? What is 2025 looking like following the sort of return to more mild, let's say, market conditions at 1-1 of 20?
Yeah, I think people are expecting a bit of stabilization on the casualty side. 1-4 is obviously very heavy on Japanese exposure. Japan's not had a brilliant cat year on the property side, so I think that it might be a bit more challenging, or people are expecting it to be a bit more challenging. And then is the wind going to blow? Is the earth going to shake?
Yeah, I think the other thing there are several brokers who talked about the role the data played in the differentiation of results. We will not go back from that. That will only continue to be a more important thing, right? The reinsurers will expect more, and like we're seeing that happening, right? The reinsurers who, as you sort of alluded to earlier, were less responsive to data are doing work to improve how they ingest different points of data into their models.
Well, it'll be a real sea change once the reinsurers are actually able to use the data, because you won't be able to hide anymore. Providing some stuff that you've made up in the hope that no one would look at it that deeply is going to become less and less acceptable.
Well, and that's already happening. Like the reinsurers, this isn't like the reinsurers that we've talked about, at least the relatively large ones who haven't built that tooling yet, isn't that they're not doing it and that they're unaware of this. It meant that tooling was not yet ready for this specific 1-1. Every one of those conversations we're in, it's like they're well in the process of building this out. And you're exactly right. It's going to mean there's less places for people to hide. And the narrative always matters because it talks about what you're trying to achieve and how the data that you have backs up the direction of travel of your business as a cedent. But it's one where the reinsurers are beginning to expect more and more to see data at a level of granularity and a level of cleanliness that allows them to do that work more quickly. There was loads of conversations we're in about that, but to evaluate you as a cedent against the other cedents in the market during renewal seasons.
Yeah.
And that's critical.
And like the number of additional requests that we see, and most critically, the time scale within which those additional data requests need to be turned around is shortening all the time. So whereas I think maybe 4 or 5 years ago, it would have been acceptable to wait 6 weeks for a different spreadsheet or a different view of data or slightly different data set or like an as-if analysis from a cedent, that stuff needs to be turned around in a few days now. Otherwise, the capacity is gone. It will go somewhere else. And I think those timescales will really continue to shorten.
I think the other thing that you will likely see happening more and more in 2025 is that the gap between winning and losing getting bigger to your point, like capacity is plentiful in the market, but it's not unlimited. And especially not unlimited from the top tier of reinsurers and capacity providers. So it's one of those ones where that capacity is going to go, and when it's gone, it's not available anymore. That's how it works. But you'll have it where the cedents who can respond to those things and can work more effectively with the data with their partners, not only will they take the capacity before it goes to other places, but what we've seen over and over and over is they will take larger chunks of that. One of the biggest pieces of feedback we've received every single conversation that we're in is one of the punishments, let's call it, for cedents by reinsurers when they don't have good data is just smaller line sizes, right? So if you sort of establish that as a baseline for the market, now you have it where cedents going, well, you've only given me 8% before, but I'm getting like 12% or 14%, and it's happening faster, it's going to mean there's less available to the sort of laggards of the cedents in the market, because it gets scooped up by the bigger players.
If you are like a regional US mutual who's largely buying proportional covers, the consequence of that is actually that your business is less stable because you just won't fill as much of the quota share as you wanted to.
Yeah. Well, and then you have options of going into those sort of middle of December conversations about, do we increase retention? Do we reduce the sort of rating criteria of our reinsurance partner? Like, what are the options available to us to get the protection that we need? And then none of them are
good.
Exactly. So I think that's what I really saw in the 2021-125 renewal was the first real shift where like the quality of data, like this is not just us talking about, we bang on about all the time. Like every single broker report talked about it.
Yeah,
it was central to the theme of casualty.
We naturally would talk about it, but I think this was the first time we saw the CEO of Swiss Re stand up at Cirque and say, you guys want to be treated as a tier one market. You need to deliver tier one data to us in order to do that. We've seen really, really big names actually, start to put a lot of emphasis and dedicate a lot of time and effort to explaining how important the data has become.
Yeah. So I think it's a tipping point moment, I think, and we'll see this being reiterated and reinforced throughout the 2025 renewals. So until then, we'll wrap up the 1/1/25 recap.
We'll be back in the middle of the year.
We'll be back in the middle of the year. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for tuning in to the Reinsurance Podcast. If you enjoyed our show, don't forget to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts and leave us a review to let us know how we're doing, preferably 5 stars. For more insights and updates, follow us on LinkedIn and visit our website at supercede.com/podcasts. You'll find the links in the show notes.